They thought my son was finished. They believed the sight of him limping into that courtroom meant they had already won. But the moment I stepped in behind him, the air shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Even Judge Reed, a man carved from stone, leaned forward and whispered, "Why are you here?" That whisper cracked through the room like thunder. I felt the metallic echo of the gavel vibrate in my bones, smelled the old paper and dust that clung to the walls, and heard my own heartbeat pounding, louder than the murmurs spreading through the gallery. They had no idea what was coming. If you've ever been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you, if you've ever dreamed of reclaiming your power, hit like, subscribe, and share your story in the comments. You're not alone. And this one is going to pull every buried emotion straight to the surface. Because this isn't just a story about revenge. It's about the day a quiet mother walked into a battlefield she once ruled. It's about the thud of my worn leather briefcase hitting the plaintiff's table, the scrape of Mateo's crutch on the cold floor, and the fading smirk on Sophia's face when she realized the past she mocked was the one thing she should have feared. The house smelled of sawdust and coffee that morning. Sunlight cutting clean lines across the workbench where Mateo spread his blueprints. There were nails and a tin on the windowsill, a crooked hammer where he left it, and the faint, honest smell of wood shavings that clung to his clothes. I remember my hands in the sink afterward, pruned and warm from work, the steady ache in my fingers that meant a day well spent. He promised no one could kick us out, I say now, and the memory comes back in the clink of cups and the echo of his laugh as he wiped his palms on his jeans. Mateo was the kind of man who built things with his hands and stubbornness. He favored battered shirts and a grin that softened his jaw. Lucia, our little spitfire, could light a room by battering a spoon against a pot. She liked to trace the knots in the wood and call them tree brains. Sophia arrived like a summer storm, bright, too polished, and at first, entirely convincing. The Delgados carried themselves with a clipped confidence that made the neighbors keep their distance. Polished cars, crisp suits, and a kind of smirk that never reached the eyes. Judge Reed had that courthouse calm about him, the kind that lives in a man who has seen enough to keep his face steady. He would be the one watching us later when everything changed. The accident happened so fast, I still see it in flashes, literally. One moment, Mateo was steady on the scaffold, hands sure on the beam. The next, there was a white flare, a smell like burning hair, and the world pitched. The scaffold gave a sick, hollow thud. I ran. The hospital was antiseptic and bright, that sharp sting of cleaning fluid everywhere, the hum of machines like distant weather. The doctor spoke in clipped sentences. They used words I would later learn to hate: catastrophic, permanent, prognosis. His skin bore the map of the moment, scars that would remember the shock longer than he could. Sophia watched through it all with a white smile that never quite reached comfort. She said the things people say at first, soft words that feel like bandages. Then she said things that did not fit a bedside vigil. She left. She smiled. I stayed. At first the changes were small and foolish. A new dress that cost more than she had ever spent on a single thing. Late nights that smelled of perfume and unfamiliar laughter. Hushed phone calls that made her lips deceive the truth. Then there was the slammed cupboard when Mateo reached for a plate and she turned away as if the touch were contagious. There was the way she refolded his clothes with a mechanical, precise bitterness, the deliberate avoidance of his hand when he reached for hers. I watched her put on jewelry and step into the world as if we were already a memory she was glad to forget. My anger was not a single flame. It was a slow burn, a steady heating that made my bones ache with purpose. I kept my face like stone while the heat built behind it. Paper arrived in a plain manila envelope, the sort of thing you expect to carry bills or a polite letter, never an accusation. Catherine Vance's name was sharp on the letterhead, each letter clipped like she spoke in tidy sentences that left no room for compassion. The words were surgical. Petition for dissolution of marriage, claim to marital property, immediate motion for temporary relief. My stomach dropped when I read them. The ink smelled of a paper mill and something colder, intent. I felt the weight of that account, the way a piece of paper could act like a lever and pry at the foundation of everything Mateo had built. The house we had filled with laughter and late dinners and the stubborn smell of sawdust suddenly read like a ledger entry to them. Catherine's voice in court was exactly as I feared, calculated, clinical. She used terms like incapacitation with a smile that implied victory. They painted Mateo as a cost, a liability. Sophia's smile in those moments was thin and practiced. The threat was no longer abstract. It had a date stamped on it, a hearing scheduled, a courtroom where our memories would be weighed against law and convenience. I held the papers in my hands until the edges softened beneath my thumb. I could smell the faint, machine-clean scent that clung to them, feel the foreignness of the ink. I could imagine their glee as they imagined our home auctioned, boxes stacked like trophies of a life they'd usurped. There are moments that mark the end of toleration. Mine came wrapped in the softest cruelty, a rehearsal of lies. I heard Sophia's voice in the kitchen, low, practiced, telling Lucia how to answer a question she hadn't heard yet. "Tell the judge you don't want to live with someone who can't take care of you," she instructed, folding the words like a soldier folding a flag. Lucia's small body trembled as if injustice had weight. I remember the taste of metal at the back of my throat, the strangely sweet anger that tasted like old coin. It was then that something in me shifted. I had been patient for years, bending and shaping our lives so Mateo could stand on his own. Watching a child trained to betray the father who had built their home was a kind of violence that law had to right. Decisions don't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they come as a small, stubborn refusal to be erased. Mine arrived with the sound of a drawer opening and the soft rustle of paper. I dug through old things, receipts, wedding photos, a worn stack of legal pads where I had once sketched arguments instead of houses. My fingers closed around an old business card with an edge slightly frayed from being slipped in and out of pockets. The name on it pulled a thread I thought I'd buried. Marcus Thorne. He had been a man I had used for facts once, a man who knew how to read people's shadows. I remember the weight of that card, how the ink had weathered, but the promise remained. I could have let the world take the house and the child and the last dignity of my son. I could have lived with the paperwork of loss. I chose otherwise. Finding Marcus wasn't ceremony. It was rain and a rectangle of light under a shop awning. He leaned against a brick wall, cigarette smoke curling up like a question mark. The rain was soft but insistently present, the alley a ribbon of reflections. I remember the smell of wet concrete and his lighter clicking. He squinted at me, the way someone reads a long story from a single page. "You look older," he said, and there was no judgment in it, only recognition. I pushed the card across the sill of the awning and watched his fingers close over the paper. He took a long drag from the cigarette, then said, "You don't want to know everything unless you're ready." The line hung between us like an accusation and an invitation. There was the sense that some truths are heavy, that evidence can wound as much as it heals. But I had already felt the weight of loss and the rawness of a child's betrayed trust. Ready or not, the choice had already been made. I had given up a career not because I wanted to, but because I chose a different kind of building, a family, a home, a life made from ordinary labors. The past I had shelved was not a relic I would let them trample. I straightened my shoulders, felt the rain settle on my hair, and answered the unasked question with the look that had gotten me through courtroom fights before. Steady, unafraid, and prepared to uncover what others would prefer remained hidden. Courtroom lights used to mean something different to me, bright, honest beams that picked out truth the way a surgeon picks out a stitch. Back then, the room smelled of old wood and the faint tang of stale cigar smoke from those who thought their money could warm any argument. I remember the heat of those lights on my face, the hush that fell when I stood, the way a judge's gavel felt less like authority and more like a metronome counting out justice. I gave that up, I left the podium and the polished shoes and the thin applause because a single handshake changed everything. They told the story later in bits and rumors. A verdict won, then stolen. I saw it as a slow unspooling, the evidence laid bare, witnesses steady, then the quiet exchange in the corridor, the briefcase slid, the fingers pressed together, and a man who had power offered the wrong kind of favor. The handshake was clean and polite. It smelled faintly of perfume and paper, but it carried the weight of ruin. Afterward, the corridor air seemed colder. Pride curdled into accusation. Shame was a new shape in my chest. I learned it the way you learn a scar, by touch and by the memory of how the skin once moved freely. When the papers arrived that made the past official, I could still taste the cigarette smoke from the men who bought verdicts as easily as they bought lunch. My name had been a brand carved from diligence and stubbornness. I had fought for people who couldn't afford a fight, for truths that were small and stubborn and right, but the system I loved had a seam, and someone had found it. My ex took a different road. He took the easy one, trading integrity for gain. He left with a smile that looked like regret rehearsed by someone who had never felt it. The betrayal felt like a courtroom with no audience, empty seats, lights that exposed a lie. There was no drama in my departure from law, no dramatic last speech, just a closing of the leather briefcase, the scent of lemon polish, and a choice. I left so Mateo could have steadier mornings, so there would be someone to open his lunch, to mend his shirts, to shepherd a boy into a man who could lay foundations, not just for houses, but for a future. Go build a life, I told him once, handing over the last of our coins in a glass jar. The metal in my pocket felt cold and honest. I sold things I loved, small luxuries, a watch that once ticked lecture hours away, and finally, the wedding ring. I remember the cool metal in my palm, how it sat, like a promise gone light. The cashier nodded as if the world sold and bought such things every day. Her indifference was a small, clinical thing that hurt in a way loud grief never did. Coins clinked into the jar. I watched them fall, precise and indifferent, like small judgments. Those sacrifices became the mortar for what we built. There were dinners with laughter circling the table, the smell of garlic and onions and the way Mateo chewed dreams aloud while sketching plans on napkins. Blueprints spread like maps to a life we intended to settle into, lines and angles that promised shelter, that promised the sound of a child's feet on stairs. Lucia's laughter was a compass in the house. She called perfect things by the wrong names and gave the world a fresh language. The routine of our days, meal prep, late-night exams, the patient folding of work shirts felt like a quiet cathedral of ordinary blessing. Then, everything changed, and silence carved itself where sound used to be. He came home different, not in the way injury marks skin, but in the way it redraws a person's center. The blueprint lines in the kitchen blurred. The light that used to catch dust motes in a friendly dance now exposed small absences. Sophia's presence, once a warm interruption, stiffened into judgment. She began to rearrange our life as if she were staging a house that didn't belong to her yet. New dresses replaced the old, and the perfume they carried seemed designed to erase the memory of grease under nails and flour on the counter. It was subtle at first, her hand slipping from his when he reached, a laugh misapplied to a joke that had never been funny, but it grew like mildew in the corners, patient and refusing to yield. The most corrosive thing happened, quieter than any of the rest. I watched her teach a child how to speak against her father. It was the smallest of acts, whispered instructions behind a closed door, a look that asked for collusion, and yet it cut deeper than the loudest slur. Children absorb more than we imagine. They are sponges for malice carried as practicalities. Lucia's eyes, when she looked at her father, changed. They were hesitant, like a bird testing a wind it once trusted. She whispered. The child cried. I watched. Short sentences, yes, but each one dropped like a pebble into a pond, sent out widening tremors. The sound of that whispered coaching lodged like a splinter in my chest. I would pick at it until it bled. There are moments that mark the end of toleration. Mine came wrapped in the softest cruelty, a rehearsal of lies. I heard Sophia's voice in the kitchen, low, practice, telling Lucia how to answer a question she hadn't heard yet. Tell the judge you don't want to live with someone who can't take care of you, she instructed, folding the words like a soldier folding a flag. Lucia's small body trembled as if injustice had weight. I remember the taste of metal at the back of my throat, the strangely sweet anger that tasted like old coin. It was then that something in me shifted. I had been patient for years, bending and shaping our lives so Mateo could stand on his own. Watching a child trained to betray the father who had built their home was a kind of violence that law had to right. Decisions don't always arrive with fanfare. Sometimes they come as a small, stubborn refusal to be erased. Mine arrived with the sound of a drawer opening and the soft rustle of paper. I dug through old things, receipts, wedding photos, a worn stack of legal pads where I had once sketched arguments instead of houses. My fingers closed around an old business card with an edge slightly frayed from being slipped in and out of pockets. The name on it pulled a thread I thought I'd buried. Marcus Thorne. He had been a man I had used for facts once, a man who knew how to read people's shadows. I remember the weight of that card, how the ink had weathered, but the promise remained. I could have let the world take the house and the child and the last dignity of my son. I could have lived with the paperwork of loss. I chose otherwise. Finding Marcus wasn't ceremony. It was rain and a rectangle of light under a shop awning. He leaned against a brick wall, cigarette smoke curling up like a question mark. The rain was soft but insistently present, the alley a ribbon of reflections. I remember the smell of wet concrete and his lighter clicking. He squinted at me, the way someone reads a long story from a single page. "You look older," he said, and there was no judgment in it, only recognition. I pushed the card across the sill of the awning and watched his fingers close over the paper. He took a long drag from the cigarette, then said, "You don't want to know everything unless you're ready." The line hung between us like an accusation and an invitation. There was the sense that some truths are heavy, that evidence can wound as much as it heals. But I had already felt the weight of loss and the rawness of a child's betrayed trust. Ready or not, the choice had already been made. I had given up a career not because I wanted to, but because I chose a different kind of building, a family, a home, a life made from ordinary labors. The past I had shelved was not a relic I would let them trample. I straightened my shoulders, felt the rain settle on my hair, and answered the unasked question with the look that had gotten me through courtroom fights before. Steady, unafraid, and prepared to uncover what others would prefer remained hidden. The stack of documents Marcus slid across the table looked ordinary enough at first. Manila folders, a greasy thumbprint here, the ragged curl of a receipt there. Up close, they tasted like iron. Not literally, but the wordless metallic tang of paper that carries other people's secrets. Numbers, dates, tiny transfers that add up to a pattern. He tapped the top sheet and let the rain outside the diner drum the rhythm of gossip. "She's not in love, she's in business," he said. And his voice had the flat, certain edge of someone who had lined up facts until they looked like a story. I read until my eyes blurred. There were bank transfers that hopped between accounts like small, furtive animals. $3,000 here, $12,000 there. Each one timed to correspond with the week she was working late. Motel receipts, faded with the cheap glamour of neon and cheap soap, proved meetings at odd hours with a name that kept surfacing. William Blackwood. Text messages threaded through the printouts, smiling faces cropped next to transaction IDs. A shorthand that spoke of arrangements more than affection. Marcus handed me a photograph, and I felt my stomach fall. Sophia laughing at a restaurant with Blackwood's arm around her, the glint of a ring I had never seen on her hand. The paper's edge cut my finger, an odd bright sting. Claims like these do not heal a broken heart, but they do make things clear. Marcus watched my face as I sifted through every scrap. He had been right before, finding the pattern in someone else's life that everyone else assumed was random. "You understand what this is?" he asked. "This isn't a love affair, it's leverage. She's converting your son's life into currency." The words landed with the weight of a verdict. I had given up courts, but truth still had a power that was unmistakable. Evidence arranged the right way could be sharper than any speech. There is a strange private grief to holding proof of betrayal. It is different from the loud demands of outrage. It hums. I thought of Lucia's little mouth being shaped into answers that weren't hers, of a daughter-in-law teaching a child to prefer a future without the father who had built their home. On the kitchen table, the documents looked like a map of intent. There was a charge in the air, a static prelude to lightning. I thought of the sound of metal on bone when the scaffold went. I thought of how Sophia's silence after that first hospital day had changed into a strategy. Evidence was the only way back into the language that counted in a courtroom. Receipts, timestamps, voices recorded without the gloss of smiles. But I also weighed the cost. There is a cruelty in courtrooms that is not only judicial, it has the particular cruelty reserved for children. I held the thought of dragging Lucia through testimony like a hot coal. She was 8, and truth extracted under pressure can become a wound you carry for a lifetime. I imagined the bright, tender thing she might be forced to hold up as Exhibit A, the tiny face under a glare of questioning. Justice requires truth, yes, but it also asks, at what cost? The refrigerator hummed in the late hours as I turned this over and over. The midnight phone with its small blue glow felt like a witness. I felt my hands tremble, not with fear, but with the weight of the choice. Marcus was practical in a way I had lost on the soft edges of motherhood. He told me what would stand up: recorded conversations in which Sophia coached Lucia, bank logs that mapped to payments from Blackwood, photos of meetings that could look innocent unless paired with a transfer receipt. He warned me about the traps lawyers set, how an accusation could be twisted into motive. His cigarette ash fell into the sink of the motel bathroom where he'd set up his temporary office. The smell of smoke mixed with the cheap shampoo in the air and felt like a different kind of testimony. "You can protect the child," he said quietly, "and still expose the scheme. We just have to be surgical." The word surgical made my jaw clench. I had once spoken in court with the steady precision Marcus described. The rhythm of it felt familiar and like an old coat I could still wear. The first recordings were the hardest. I had sat across a small table from Lucia and simply asked her to play, to tell me about school, about the color of her teacher's shoes. A recorder lay under a napkin, and the sound of her breathing was so ordinary it hurt. Then I steered the conversation, gentle and careful, until a memory of Sophia's voice came through. Soft, molding, telling a child how to answer a question that hadn't been asked yet. Lucia's small protest, "I don't want to lie, I love Daddy," broke me. It was the evidence that mattered most, the kind that made a courtroom sit up. Afterwards, I swore I would never make her say anything for the judge that could break her. But the recording existed now, and with it, a moral calculus. Protect the child from trauma or shield the child and risk a legal defeat that would change the child's life forever. I learned to move through the house like a person practicing a ritual. Photographs were photographed, documents scanned, deeds copied and triple-checked. There was a ritual to collecting truth, clean hands, methodical stacking, each piece numbered. I put the deed to the house beneath a ledger I had kept of expenses from the years Mateo apprenticed, the receipts for tools he bought with his first wages, the certificate from the engineering school he had earned when I'd pawned the watch to pay tuition. Each item was a small altar to memory. I rehearsed the lines I might have to speak. "Your Honor, with your permission." The words felt like armor when I said them aloud in the kitchen, practiced into clarity, crisp as breath on a cold morning. Polish matters. Presence matters even more. I ironed a plain blouse and looked at myself in the mirror like a lawyer once did before she stepped into a courtroom. It wasn't vanity, it was preparation for recognition. A woman's certainty can be disarming when paired with evidence. I cleaned the briefcase, checked the recorder's batteries, labeled the folders in a hand steadied by resolve. "Your Honor, with your permission." I said it again, softer, imagining the judge's gavel and the hush that precedes a decision. Each rehearsal smoothed out the jagged edges of fear. The first hearing was a test of tone. Catherine Vance arrived like a practiced sentence, precise, cold, hungry for the victory that smelled like a settlement. Sophia sat beside her, an immaculate smile, the kind that suggested a rehearsed innocence. The gallery was a collection of whispers. When I stood, I could feel the weight of eyes that measure presence. I moved slowly, the briefcase under my arm a weight like responsibility. The smell of the courtroom, old wood, lemon polish, faint cologne, was a small, immutable world where words counted for more than intentions. I filed a procedural motion not to win right away, but to stop an immediate transfer. It was small and precise, a request to block any change in title pending a full hearing. Legal language is a craft I knew. I used it like a scalpel to halt their momentum. Catherine's eyebrows rose, just a fraction, a micro-expression that betrayed surprise at being countered not with fire but with law. The judge read the motion, his face a quiet landscape of deliberation. For a moment, time seemed to slow. The gallery bent forward as if the air itself were charged. That moment was small but crucial. The clerk's pen scratched the ruling. Temporary relief granted. I felt the briefcase in my hands as if it were a steadying heart. The motion had not won the war, but it had bought us ground. Momentum shifted like a tide pulling back before a storm. Sophia's smile quivered and then steadied, the mask repaired by the practiced fingers of someone who'd made a trade and expected no consequences. Catherine's voice cooled into analysis rather than delight. For the first time, they had to account for something tangible on the record. What followed was the courtroom recognition that prickled my skin the moment it happened. Judge Reed's eyes lifted and lingered on the briefcase, on my posture, and then on my face with a look that blended memory and astonishment. "Why are you here?" he asked. Not loud, but the hush made it echo. For a heartbeat, I thought of all the reasons one might be in a courthouse: duty, vengeance, curiosity. But the answer that steadied on my tongue was the one I had practiced in the kitchen and in the dark of sleepless nights. "I am here for justice, not revenge," I heard myself say. The sentence landed like a small, clear bell. It was true, and it shaped everything to come. The gallery that day contained faces I knew, the neighbors who had watched our house rise, the clerks who had seen me in other years, but it also contained those who smelled opportunity. I watched Sophia's expression shift from smug certainty to a flash of something like fear. Catherine's professional mask thinned. In that brief instant, the past and present collided. A woman who had once filled courthouses with argument had returned not as an avenger, but as a shield. Paper, evidence, and a calm voice had combined to make an arrival that could not be dismissed. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Standing in the center of that courtroom felt like stepping back into a room I had once owned. Only this time, the lights did not intimidate me. They invited me to be seen. I set the briefcase down with a deliberate thud that cut through the low hum of conversation. Paper shuffled. A pen clicked somewhere near the bench. Judge Reed, who had presided over 1,000 quiet decisions, leaned forward as if the motion of my body had a sound he finally recognized. I felt the weight of the room settle on my shoulders and turned it into steadiness. "My name is Elena Marquez," I began, my voice even, shaped by years of practice I had thought lost. "I'll be representing my son, Mateo." The words landed like a bolt. The cadence I chose was measured. Short phrases when I wanted the court to breathe, longer sentences when I wanted the facts to stretch and occupy space. The briefcase between my hands felt less like an object and more like a pulse. Evidence, memory, proof. The papers inside were a kind of armor. The first thing I did was take the marital conversion claim apart, piece by careful piece. I slid the deed across the table with my finger on its edge and watched the ink glisten under the courtroom light. "These deeds predate the marriage," I said, crisp and intentional, letting the technicalities do the heavy lifting. Catherine Vance's expression, which had been all clinical smile and clipped words, registered a tiny falter. She had practiced contempt as currency. The sight of an old ownership document reframed it as fraud if you read it the way the law demands. I felt the judge's attention shift, the kind of pivot that measures credibility. I methodically showed timelines, receipts for the foundation, photographs of framing stages, and invoices with dates that could not be argued away. Each paper had a small story, handwritten notes, the corner folded by a builder's thumb. I could see the logic working on the faces in the gallery. The ledger into which our life had been written slowly became something the bench could hold in its hands. Legal history matters in moments like these. A house built before a marriage is not marital property to be divided as if conjured by matrimony. The law can be dry and stubbornly literal, and today that literalness bent back in our favor. When the time came to play the recording, the air in the room changed like weather. I placed the device on the table. It was small and unremarkable, almost fragile. Lucia's voice came through first, soft, uneven. Then Sophia's hush, coaxing and wrong. The sound design of the moment mattered, a child's breath, the scrape of a chair, the low, manipulative cadence of an adult telling a child to shape their truth. "Tell the judge you don't want to live with someone who can't take care of you," Sophia's voice urged. The instruction folded into the ordinary noises of a home, like rotten fruit hidden among ripe apples. The courtroom's oxygen seemed to slow. Lucia's small, trembling protest, "I don't want to lie, I love Daddy," arrived like a struck bell, and the room caught on the vibration. I watched faces change from curiosity to a kind of horror that is civilized people recognizing childish coercion. There is nothing theatrical about a child's voice tethered to fear. It is the most devastating evidence there is because it is so pure and so unshielded. The sound of that confession made the abstract concept of coercion suddenly concrete for everyone in the room. Catherine made an attempt to control the damage by attacking me instead of addressing the content. She dredged up the old rumor she hoped would stick. My disgrace. The story that I had retreated from law under a cloud. Her tone was surgical, as if to say my past should undermine my present. The gallery leaned in. Opponents try that trick because character can sometimes smear facts in the public mind. Her words were precise, designed to make the judge see me as compromised. I felt the old heat rise, the steady furnace of indignation that had warmed me through cases once. But I met her claim with calm. I did not deny a past that had been messy. I explained it. I told the truth of the verdict that was stolen, of the handshake that changed the outcome and stole faith from a courtroom I had once trusted. I spoke of a man who preferred a quick gain to the integrity of the process and of my choice to step away rather than become complicit in a system that had been bought. There was no bitter rhetoric in what I said, only detail, clarity, and the kind of quiet that proves steadiness. Judge Reed's eyes softened when I told that part of the story. He had known the shape of me long before this day. He remembered my work when it was not news. He vouched for a truth I could not conjure on my own, that I had not been disgraced by incompetence, but had been boxed out by corruption. The validation from him landed like a legal hand on the scale. Silence unfurled across the room like a folded flag. In that silence, I felt a private applause. No one actually clapped, but the small satisfaction of right said in the right place hummed in my ribs. Evidence, what I call the quiet army of truth, stacked in front of us. Bank logs that mapped payments, motel receipts that placed meetings at times convenient for conspirators, messages that threaded a pattern between Sophia and William Blackwood. Each item was measured against a timeline that did not allow for innocent explanation. William's name appeared in logs with the same monotony as a drumbeat. It no longer read like rumor, but like a map. The discovery that someone outside the marriage was systematically backing Sophia's moves reframed the entire conflict. It was not a private marital spat. It was a targeted campaign of acquisition. They scrambled in fits and starts. The Delgados tried their smiles, their body language, their hush of confident whispers. William Blackwood's allies tried obfuscation, alternate accounts, vague denials, evasions that had the hollow sound of a practiced lie. But evidence, when properly presented, leaves less room to wiggle. We had not come to the courtroom with the intent to humiliate, but to clarify. When truth is taped down to dates and numbers, the freedom to spin narratives collapses like a house of cards. Between the legal maneuvering and the formalities, I never lost sight of the human stakes. I could see Matteo seated, jaw clenched, the new lines around his eyes made deeper by pain and patience. Lucia sat clutching a small toy, trying to be brave in a place too big for her. Their faces kept my voice focused, kept my argument spare of anything that would distract the law. I spoke for them, for the memory of years of work, for the small things, tools, the smell of sawdust, the pattern of nightlights in a child's room. That make a house a home. Catherine tried another tack, to paint me as a woman looking for revenge, to suggest my motivation was not justice but personal vindication. I met that with the same steadiness. I told them plainly, my motives are anchored in evidence and in the safety of my family. If exposing someone's greed is part of that, then so be it. I uttered those words not in triumph, but as a clear demarcation. The argument must remain about facts, not theatrics. As evidence accumulated, I saw Sophia's mask begin to crack. The practiced ease of a woman used to being able to buy outcomes showed fissures. Her smile faltered as message after message and wire transfer after wire transfer threaded together into a design more commercial than romantic. The smugness that once warmed her features cooled into something like panic. People who rely on leverage do not like being exposed to daylight. At one point, I paused and looked at Matteo. He was breathing in a way that said he trusted me enough to exhale. I leaned close and whispered, because whispers in court can feel like a private contract made in front of strangers. Hold on. The words were less theatrical than necessary. They were a tether between us. They were a promise that this house, this life, would not be taken without being weighed in the light. The gallery gasped quietly as another piece of evidence landed. The name Blackwood on a line of correspondence that spoke of terms and investment. Here, the story ceased to be private and became part of a larger economy of exploitation. It is one thing to be wronged by a loved one. It is another to be preyed upon by a man whose currency was influence and who treated relationships as balance sheets. The court had to see that this was a scheme, not a romance. The day drew on, and the work continued. Questions answered, objections sustained or overruled, the subtle choreography that is litigation. My voice remained clear. The briefcase remained a steady presence at my side. In the spaces between the arguments, I could feel the tide shifting. The air tasted of lemon cleaner and old wood, but beneath it was the metallic tang of truth laid out like a map of where we had been and where we would stand. When the session adjourned, we did not leave convinced of victory. Law is a slow-moving machine. But there was a different temperature in the hallway. People who had come expecting an easy sweep away of a small family began to talk in lower tones. Catherine arranged her papers, her jaw tightened, and Sophia avoided my look as if she might find a way to stitch herself back together. The courtroom had seen a woman return not as a relic, but as a practitioner of facts and a guardian of her family's dignity. We stepped out into the light that filtered into the courthouse vestibule. The city hummed around us in its ordinary ways, cars, bus brakes, a street vendor calling out. But for a moment, the world felt rearranged, as if the lines we had fought to make visible were now part of the public map. I squeezed Matteo's hand and let the briefcase rest against my hip like something that had found its place again. The battle was not over. Far from it, but the queen of law, the woman who had once commanded rooms like this, had awakened not to seek vengeance, but to ensure that justice had a chance to do what it's meant to do. Hold on, I said once more, softer this time, and it was both a reassurance and an order, a small steady command to keep the faith while the wheels turned. The courtroom seemed to pull its breath in as I stepped forward to deliver what would be the last words I allowed to stand between my family and ruin. The lights above softened, or perhaps my eyes had sharpened. Either way, the room felt like a body that had grown still to listen. I looked at Matteo first, his jaw clenched, his knuckles white around the crutch, the quiet line of his shoulders telling me he had already given more than most ever ask of a man. Lucia sat a few rows back, a small knot of concentration as she pressed crayons to paper, drawing shapes that looked like houses and suns and the safe things children make when the adult world grows loud. When I rose, every movement had a weight to it, not from hesitation, but from purpose. My briefcase rested on the table like a book of truth. I opened it and let the papers breathe, each page a small proof of the life they wanted to take. My voice found a cadence that balanced law with the rawness of a mother who had watched her son be measured like inventory. "Your Honor," I began, the words settling into the room, "this house is built from his blood and my hands." The sentence was not a plea for sentimentality so much as a mapping of cause and effect. Bones, labor, sacrifice. The smell of lemon cleaner and old wood filled the pauses between the sentences I laid out. Dates, invoices, testimony that traced out a life built, not bought. I did not speak only as counsel. I spoke as the woman who had once tucked Mateo in with a story and a hand on his hair. I spoke as the one who had sold a ring so he could study, the one who had learned to stitch a life out of thrift and stubborn love. I let the legal facts sit side by side with the human ones. The invoices for the foundation, the pay stubs from the months he worked overtime, the photographs of the house, stage by stage. The court is a place that prefers ordered proof, and I arranged mine with care, an argument in the language it understood. Between paragraphs of case law, I slipped the moment when he had handed me the keys and whispered, "No one can kick us out now." The image was plain, a promise held in his rough hands. It translated the evidence back into why we had been fighting at all. There were moments when the words threatened to swell, where my voice might have turned to accusation or spectacle, and I clipped them thin so they would not give the defense room to claim theatrics. Instead, I anchored what I said in the specific. Dates, witnesses, the precise nature of the transfers that had funded the conspirators. I watched Catherine counting the beats between my sentences, searching for a chink, a moment to strike. She found none. The room listened like a vessel being filled with undeniable weight. When I finished, I stepped back and felt the quiet settle like dust. Then, in the hallway that smelled faintly of coffee and old coats, I watched the waiting room become a theater of nerves. Lucia had put down her crayons. She had that small, tight line around her mouth that children make when they are trying very hard to be brave. I held her hand for a moment and noticed how warm it was, the way her small fingers curled into mine, not because of fear, but because she was choosing trust. Sophia paced like a caged thing, her heels tapping a rhythm of impatience and arrogance. Her face was painted in a smile grown brittle by anxiety. The Delgados clustered by the window, low voices heavy with calculations rather than compassion. My knuckles rested on the armrest of the chair, and I realized I had been unconsciously kneading them to stop the tremor of waiting turning visible. Waiting rooms are strange places where time becomes elastic. Minutes stretch and then snap. I breathed in the antiseptic air, tasted the metallic tang of nerves, and then turned inward, cataloging everything I had done to prepare. There was a tight chorus of hope and fear singing behind my ribs. Hope that truth would carry weight. Fear that the law, with all its ordered majesty, can sometimes bow to power. Short thoughts crossed my mind like quick birds. Hold on. Be steady. We did what we had to. Each was a line I repeated to myself like a rosary, a counting of small certainties. When the judge took the bench, the room constricted into a single line of attention. He read in measured tones, the kind that drag a sentence into the shape of finality. The first words held the gravity of a gavel before it falls. "In the matter of Marquez versus Delgado," he started, and everyone leaned. I felt each syllable like a footfall. He laid out his reasoning in a voice that belonged to a man who understood both the letter of the law and, perhaps, the spirit of fairness. The divorce was granted. The dissolution of marital status, a legal formalism that acknowledged what had already been true in their relationship. Then, he turned to the property and custody matters, and the air felt that second again, the one before storm breaks. When he ruled that the house would remain with Mateo, that the deeds proved a premarital ownership not subject to conversion, the sound of his words seemed to travel in slow motion. It is a strange sensation when relief moves through a room as if it were a gust of warm air, faces slackened, eyes wet, jaws unclenched. Sophia's face went through every stage, shock, disbelief, the first flush of panic before slackening into stupefaction. William Blackwood's presence, once a shadow in the gallery of motive, evaporated in swift, mortified motion. He rose as if to speak and then left in a manner that announced retreat without words. The Delgados lowered their heads, their confident posture dissolving like sugar in rain. For a breath, I saw all the ways the verdict would change things. The immediate practicalities, titles, transfers, checks that would not be cut, and the deeper human ones, the knowledge that truth had been acknowledged in public, that a child would not be forced to choose under pressure, that a son's dignity had been legally recognized. When the judge read that custody of Lucia would be awarded primarily to Mateo, with consideration for supervised visitation as necessary for Sophia, the room's stillness felt like a merciful thing. To watch a child moved from a drumbeat of coercion into a space of protection is a kind of victory that cannot be measured in papers alone. Mateo's shoulders sagged in a way that told me he had been holding his breath for so long he had forgotten how to exhale. He wept in a small, private way that made my throat tighten. I moved toward him without thinking. His shirt was damp where his tears had soaked through, the scent of him. Tobacco from years of labor, a faint lemon from the cleaner he'd used to wipe the floor was a map of the life we had rebuilt. Lucia ran to him like a tiny comet, arms wrapped around that knee, and the sound of their embrace was the kind of music that feels like home. I remember the pressure of Mateo's hand on the back of my neck, the texture of his stubble against my palm, and the way the courtroom felt suddenly ordinary again. Chairs, papers, the scratch of a pen, but held now in a new light. There was triumph, yes, but also an ache. Legal victories never come without cost. The scars on Mateo's skin, the nights Lucia had sat up because of whispered arguments, the trust frayed by deception. These things do not evaporate with a judge's pronouncement. I felt both relief and mourning in equal measure. Someone else's greed had been exposed, but the price we had paid to get there was etched into our time. I touched the corner of a folded document and felt the small, velvety weight of what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. Outside, the courthouse steps glowed with dusk. The city seemed softer, as if it agreed to let us step into a different rhythm for a few hours. We walked slowly, not because we had to, but because our legs wanted to remember each step. Lucia chattered about small things, about crayons and the blue house she had drawn. Her voice a high, bright thing that cut through the heaviness. Mateo walked with the crutch, but with a straightness that had less to do with posture and more with the way his chest felt. Fuller. People on the steps glanced our way, the casual curiosity of a stranger, softened by the hint that what they'd witnessed had been meaningful. I thought aloud about the way justice is often slow and how its slowness can feel cruel when you are in the middle of a storm. Justice is not always immediate, I said, more to myself than to anyone else. But it has a stubborn way of catching up when you keep your facts clean and your purpose true. It sounded like a law school aphorism, and perhaps it was, but it rang truer because I had lived it not in a classroom, but in the slow hours of grocery lists and bedtime stories. Then came the small, everyday things that make victory worth the fight, returning to the house and hearing the floorboards creak in familiar places, smelling the faint trace of sawdust when Mateo opened the garage door, watching Lucia set the table with plates she arranged with a solemn diligence. There is a kind of domestic redemption in the return to routine. It is where dignity gets stitched back into daily life. We sat on the porch that evening, the light bruising into amber, and I watched my family breathe easier. There was laughter, a small, tentative thing at first, and the comfort of a meal eaten without pretense. I shared with them what I had told the court in clipped phrases, not to boast, but to map the truth back into the world where the people who matter live. We kept the house, I said simply. We get to keep the life we built. Mateo squeezed my hand, and Lucia leaned against his leg, and the simplicity of that image felt like a kind of benediction. There is profound work in rebuilding the sense of safety after an assault on trust. It is not flashy, it is not headline-making, but it is real. In the quiet that evening, I thought about the thin line between justice and revenge. Revenge is raw, a roaring engine that consumes as much as it claims. Justice, at its best, is precise and steady. It reconstructs the moral architecture of a wrong done. I had not gone to the courtroom to humiliate, but to correct a wrong, to anchor my family in the truth of what we had built and who we were. The choice to pursue law's path rather than a more personal vindication was intentional. It preserved something essential in us, the capacity to say no to cruelty without becoming cruel ourselves. We reclaimed our home, but perhaps what we reclaimed most fiercely was a form of humanity that asks for fairness before it asks for punishment. There is power in restraint, in allowing facts to do the speaking, and in protecting a child from becoming a tool in the service of greed. I do not pretend the road ahead is without challenge. Matteo's rehabilitation will be a slow and stubborn thing. Lucia will require patient rebuilding of trust that does not speak in terms of evidence, but in quiet time and small, predictable kindnesses. Still, the verdict delivered more than legal protection. It bought us a chance to mend. As the sun settled and the city began its evening chorus, I felt a gratitude that was both private and vast. Not everyone gets a judge who listens. Not every truth gets its day. We had been lucky in ways that were born of preparation, of keeping records, of having courage to speak, and of choosing to replace fear with method. The lesson I would pass on to anyone listening is not a strategy for revenge, but an ethic for protection. Keep careful, keep clear, and fight, not to destroy, but to restore. We had stood at the edge of losing everything and stepped back into the light. Our victory had cost more than the papers could show, but it had returned something truer than property. The right to wake in a house that belonged to us, to tell stories on the porch, to raise a child without coercion lodged in her tongue. The quiet of that evening felt like a new beginning, a slow mending of edges. We reclaimed home, but we kept our humanity. The storm finally eased, leaving behind a quiet that felt earned. The house no longer echoed with fear or uncertainty. It breathed with us again. Lucia's laughter returned in full color, bright and unburdened, a sound that stitched the last torn edges of our lives back together. We learned that truth, when held steady, does not crack under pressure, and courage, when acted on, becomes its own kind of shelter. We stood our ground, we protected what mattered, and we rebuilt not just walls, but trust. If this revenge saga gave you that rush of justice, smash like, subscribe for more epic tales, and share your revenge story in the comments. Click the next video box for another one. On the porch, evening pooled softly around us. I rested a hand on Matteo's shoulder while Lucia curled beside him, and the house, ours, glowed in the last warm sweep of daylight.